We're the book friends that think good.
What does this mean for our life, for our world? Yiggity yeet, my dude. I'm happy to speak. Always happy to think.
I don't know how to do that. I can look into that.
Makes you sound like a book friend that can think good.
It's Jack and it's Weston.
BFTTGs. Yeah.
Jack, I think good. Sometimes I good think, too.
Makes you sound pretty good.
We might want to make it more concise. We're going to attempt to grapple and answer 3 questions. Number 1, what did we learn? Number 2, what did we disagree with? And number 3, what are we going to do about it? I am ready to roll.
I'm in it. Weston, my book friend, tell me, what book is it that we're thinking good about today?
Today, we are talking about Chapter 11 of Field Guide to Lies and Statistics. How does science work?
How science works. A lot of this conversation in this chapter is about logic, and this is another one of those chapters, like the chapter where you started talking about probabilities, where it reads kind of like a textbook in parts. But here are the subtitles for us. There's deduction and induction, talking about those different ways of arriving at conclusions. A deductive argument, and that's it. He talks about arguments as well. So he talks about arguments, and then specifically in a deductive argument. And that first section, like I said, is called deduction and induction, and drawing the distinction between deduction, starting from the general and getting specific, and induction, starting from specific, drawing general conclusions from that.
That's funny.
So,
I definitely thought that abduction was a subheading in this chapter.
Yeah, no, abduction just jumped out at me though. And I will say, I'll just start with that. That was my first learning. I never took a logic course. So you probably knew about all of this stuff pretty well. But for me, the distinction between abduction or deduction and induction was something I was familiar with from science, just general like philosophy and math and stuff like that. But abduction was a new concept to me. And just that section on page 191 where he draws that out, talking about Sherlock Holmes, how Sherlock Holmes often draws conclusions through clever reasoning. And although he claims to be using deduction, he's in fact using a different form of reasoning called abduction. Nearly all of Holmes' conclusions are clever guesses based on facts, but not in a way that the conclusion is airtight or inevitable. And I thought that was just really interesting and an important distinction to draw in logical how conclusions are drawn logically.
Yeah, that was one of my big notes is, well, one, like you said, because I've taken logic courses and, have a whole philosophy degree, this is a lot of just, review for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have a ton of learnings, but I did, now that I'm later on in my life or whatever, I was like, man, I think that a lot of the disagreements between my wife and I happen because I am making deductive arguments or inductive. And she's making abductive arguments. And so there'll be a lot of times where she'll like make a claim about something. Maybe not a lot. And they're not like huge fights, mostly like disagreements.
Yeah.
Because I've learned to let things go a little bit.
Nice.
Because
valuable skill.
You knew me when I was younger and I was much more, it depends on context now, but I can be very, very exacting with my terminologies and semantics that we're using. And, so that got me in trouble with my relationship with my wife early on because she would make, some abductive reasoning and, maybe something about, I guess the example that came to my mind as I was reading the chapter was like gossip about people or something, or that, that comes up. And I would be like, well, that's maybe not necessarily the case. And I would lay out some points that would be like, well, it doesn't necessarily follow from the evidence that you've been provided that this is the conclusion.
She's like, shut up.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I don't care what the evidence says.
So yeah, I've gotten into trouble for not agreeing with abductive reasoning.
Yeah, I will say I didn't like make a note of that as well. It's like, while it's important to make note of this, like not all conversations or like deduction, induction, abduction is not like a trinary that we should run all like everything through. Like
Right.
sometimes conversation is just conversation, and like, hearsay is just hearsay, and like that's it. Like there's no need to like dissect everything.
Yeah.
Um,
I will say
but
though, the section where he's giving those examples and then he starts going through like the math logic puzzles,
yeah,
like
yeah,
that, like that's obviously the most simple versions, but like that's the sort of stuff I was talking about in the previous
yeah,
chapter where I was like, it makes me miss doing those like equations with them.
yeah. Syllogisms.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
doing like the more complex they get, there's all these like, it's kind of like math, but there's all these new symbols. So for my
yeah,
nerdy brain, it was really fun. Because I was
yeah.
like, oh, new fun math toys I get to use.
Yeah, I
Um,
will say another thing I appreciated about this chapter and that I really liked. I think his best writing in this book is like instructional.
I would agree
Um,
with that. I would agree with
and
that.
like, because he's a very good teacher and he's very like entertaining, and like some of his examples are pretty funny. But he does a good job of drawing like salient examples that like accurately illustrate the point and give you like abilities to like connect connect the concept, like the Converse, when he's talking about Converse and he's like, if Chuck Taylor is wearing Converse shoes and his feet are covered, like using that as a specific example to like help you learn the Converse is really interesting.
Yeah, I would say it's funny that you say that because I feel like his examples have been kind of hit or miss for me.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, because I think some of his examples are just like, granted, I think a lot of times he's trying to use very obvious examples, but then some of his
Yeah.
examples sometimes tend to like be too niche where
Mm.
I want like a more practical or like
Yeah.
pragmatic applicable example. Um, but
Yeah. He does do this thing where he like jumps to like massive, he makes massive jumps. And I think that this chapter is not as guilty of it as the next one is. There's like some pretty
I would
massive,
agree with that. I would
massive
agree
leaps.
with
We'll get
that.
into that later.
Yeah. Yes,
We'll
we
get
will.
into that later. But for now, any other learnings for you, Weston, on this chapter?
Um, no, not really. But like you kind of mentioned, like I have a pretty good background with this stuff anyway. So it
Mhm.
just reminded me of a lot of fun stuff.
Yeah. I think one of the other things that I found interesting about this chapter and like kind of a learning is like how much of like our language and the way that we think is like described in Latin language. Like he uses a couple examples of Latin in
Well,
this
yeah, just
chapter.
the names for the argument
Yeah.
structures. Gosh, I'm trying to find the page they're on. But yeah,
Yeah.
I just wanted to just go
It's
back to
just,
Latin.
yeah. Yeah. It's just funny. It's just like, it's just one of those things that makes me think about like when we were talking about Mark Twain, and I can't even remember the guy's name now. The second guy who could have been Mark Twain.
Point
Look at that.
proven.
It's already slipped my mind. But yeah, when we were talking about that, just how much is lost. And I think about like lost in translation when I see stuff like that, because it's like the name of this is Latin word, which basically means this. And it's like, I wonder if that's really what that means, because this is so exact,
Mm-hmm.
like the logic, like the logic cases are so exacting, like you said.
Mm.
If there's a slight mistranslation, it can completely change what that actually means.
I mean, maybe, but I think for those phrases, they're pretty open to interpretation too. Plus, isn't it like, I mean, Latin had like it didn't have the biggest vocabulary, right? So,
Mm.
isn't it kind of like Hebrew where there's like a ton of words that mean multiple things, like at least
Yeah,
when written
yeah.
down?
Well, and there's not very many base words. There's lots of like, you know,
Prefixes, suffixes,
prefixes,
that sort of stuff.
suffixes, but yeah, but like base vocabulary, there's not a lot. Kind of like Hebrew, um, which is really interesting. Another thing I like about these chapters is I like when he introduces like graphics or like cartoons,
Yeah.
like this guy with the automobiles. I wish that I kind of wish this book was consistent in that. like
he had a much
every
easier time doing
chapter.
that in the numbers. In part 1 in the numbers, he had a much
Yeah.
easier time doing that. But then the second part of the book about words, it
Yeah.
was like graphic,
Which I guess makes
deplete.
sense. He wasn't talking specifically about graphs. So
Yeah.
Did you have any pushback
No,
in
I thought
this
this chapter was
chapter?
pretty straightforward, just explaining different arguments and how they're structured. I didn't think there was like much to even push back on in this chapter.
Mhm.
What
Yeah.
about you?
No, I actually didn't have any pushbacks. I didn't write any down. Like I said, I just found this to be like pretty good information. And I think it's the best examples of his writing are in chapters like this, where he's explaining a lot of concepts.
Yeah, I think he definitely does good as an instructional writer rather than a like editorial writer.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think this particular section was my favorite because I thought it connected concepts in a really good way. Like what am I trying to say? Like synthesis of ideas here is really interesting, where he talks about on page 184, probability, as introduced in part 1, is deductive. We work from general information to specific predictions. Statistics is inductive. We work from a particular set of observations to a general statement. Or as another example, we would use probability to indicate the likelihood that a particular headache medicine will help you. If your headache doesn't go away, we use statistics to estimate the likelihood your pill came from a bad batch. I think that was a really interesting connection and like helpful in kind of framing like these mathematical systems as more than just mathematical systems.
Yes, I do think that's a good section there at the beginning of the chapter.
And more broadly speaking, I think that is just something like that kind of critical thinking is the kind of thing that helps you to grab onto the handholds that I think he's been asking people to grab onto. It's like, well, not just like what do I do in the face of like dubious statistics, but like, here's one way to view statistics. Like statistics are inductive in nature. Like that's kind of interesting because it tells you like, oh, we're drawing conclusions off of data. Like that was a concept that I think should have been introduced much earlier in the book and would have helped a lot, and something that he could have drawn on frequently when talking about logical fallacies. And like, how do you critically think about these things? Well, consider like this other area of thinking, like what are people doing when they're presenting statistics? Well, ultimately, they're trying to draw conclusions from specifics. I think that was just a really, really salient observation.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably why I didn't have as many pushbacks or negative feelings about this chapter too.
Mm-hmm.
Because I felt like there was, like you said, kind of something to grab onto and be like, okay, I can at least take that away from this chapter and at least have it as like an interesting concept or an interesting viewpoint on these things, right? So
yeah,
I definitely felt better about reading this chapter, or at least not as like frustrated at the end of it,
Yeah, totally. I think it naturally has an optimistic bend where it's like, oh, here's something you can learn.
Yes.
And like, here's information you can use to arm yourself. Like, I think that is helpful, and wish that there was just more consistency with that throughout this book, I think.
Yeah.
So
what are you going to take away from it now that we're talking about taking aways? What are you going to take away?
Well, one is to wash my hands because that's the end, like the end analogy.
No, wait, for real? Are you for real though?
No, I'm just kidding.
Because I feel like we were bombarded with that the last 3 years. Wash your hands,
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. What are you thinking?
20 seconds, like, dude.
Yeah. You need to know the story of Ignaz Semmelweis, it's just funny. Like that would have been an interesting anecdote, but I feel like during the last few years, I saw that like passed around social media a lot, which is just interesting.
Yeah, because it was used a lot, which again, this didn't happen when this book was written, so
yeah,
can't blame him for that.
Yeah. I don't know. I think taking from this, what am I taking from this? I guess one of the things is just like, because I'm not very familiar with logic, thinking about logical systems and asking myself like, oh, am I drawing like is this inductive thinking, deductive thinking, or abductive thinking? And I think that like that third category is really interesting because I think probably a lot of what we naturally sort of conclude logically is abductive. Like I think we kind of think like, well, this general idea and this general idea, like, and that's, we create a bridge between them.
I mean, I don't know if it's most of the time, but
Yeah.
I think we use it a lot. Probably more than we should in general.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's also a useful form of thinking
It is.
because like,
It's
because
very-
he's thinking about like the likelihood of things and what that naturally could lead to. Like,
well,
like that Sherlock Holmes example is so good. Where he's like, well, it's highly unlikely given this, you know, general scenario that I've viewed that this thing is not true.
Well, and they're kind of like the most interesting. I mean, think about all I know it's Sherlock Holmes is probably who started it or that writer, but it's like, dude, so many crime shows are like based around abductive reasoning.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, totally.
Criminal Minds is one of my wife's favorite shows. It's like, I was thinking about that. It's like, that's all abductive reasoning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The first thing that came to mind to me was Survivor. I was thinking of like reality TV, how it's like, well, so-and-so did this thing, so they're probably going to do this thing. And like, that's what most of the conversations are about.
Yeah. They're just totally, yeah, that's true. But I would say like, there's other things where we use a lot of deductive and a lot of inductive reasoning.
I think
but it's like over, it's like over. We do a lot of over generalizing, and then we do a lot of I don't know, what would be the opposite of over generalizing? I don't know.
The opposite?
Yeah,
under
right?
generalizing, specifying.
Yeah, I guess we specify
like,
too much.
Yeah.
I
think one what's analysis paralysis?
Yes.
Yeah. I think one thing that immediately came to mind here was just like practicing different techniques logically of things, because here's one problem my wife and I are trying to solve right now is why our daughter isn't sleeping. And so the question is like, I think that we have like fallen victim to like inconsistent logic around this. Like some nights we will know like, oh, she slept well. And so we're doing the deductive thing about like, okay, so she slept well. So we'll break down the last 24 hours and like, why did she sleep well? And then another night we'll think like we'll wake up and we'll be like, man, it's been like weeks of terrible sleep. And then we'll do this like inductive sort of thing about like, what are we doing that's causing this sleep pattern or whatever? Like, how do we build a better sleep pattern based on the things that we did do? And like, how do we not do those? And I think like that's an area where abductive thinking could be very helpful for us, where it's like, well, noting like these things, it's pretty likely that like we could get good sleep if we do these things. And like, if we don't do these things, it's pretty likely that we won't get good sleep. So I think just like, that's a very specific area where I could apply different forms of logic to help me like problem solve and to help my wife and I problem solve.
I mean, that's true. I guess now that we're thinking about it, I mean, I have to do that all the time as a teacher too.
Yeah.
What is the most likely scenario here?
Yeah.
When solving issues between kids or figuring out who did what or
yeah.
And I will say I have been complimented on my sleuthing ability, which
really?
I definitely give credit to my logic classes, and because that's like how many Pokemon cards I've recovered at club, dude. I've seen that's where I've gotten the most compliments is like figuring out which card was stolen, which card was actually not traded correctly or something like that.
Do you ever?
And I'm the fake expert too. If they think a card's fake, I'm the one they have to show it to. So,
do you ever pull a bamboozle on the kids? Where you're like, well, we're just making up kids' names here, but you're like, Adrian said X, but Samantha said Y. Thus, it cannot be that Jackson is holding
do I do
card
that?
B. Yeah.
I mean, I've definitely said sentences to that effect. I thought you meant make up a kid.
No.
No, dude, I've definitely said sentences like that where I've like
Yeah.
brought over their trade history sheets and I'm like, this person traded this for that. This person traded that one for that and that. So therefore you cannot, right? So it's like definitely,
Yeah.
I've definitely done that.
Nice.
Definitely done that.
Nice. Impress the kids with that big brain ability. That
I
good
wouldn't-
thinking.
I wouldn't say impressed. I mean, the kids weren't impressed because kids aren't impressed. And it's funny enough because they think that like adults know so much, you know, like they're
Yeah.
not impressed
Yeah.
typically because they think everyone, they're like the adults know everything about everything for the most part. And
That's-
so
I
they're like,
think-
they're not surprised. It's more like my teacher teammates who are helping with club who have been like, dude, nice job figuring that out.
Nice. Well, that's one of the things that I think, and we talked about this a little bit in Atomic Habits, is the difference between outcome and process. Like, I think when you're young, you see like outcome as the thing,
Yeah.
but you realize like it's actually process.
Yeah.
Like professional athletes are naturally skilled, but they're also obsessive about the skills that they practice, and they practice those things nonstop, and that's how they get better. That's how they become elite. Is like it's all process. You have to like love the process, not the result.
Yeah. Mine was similar to what you said initially. My takeaway was just like, be more cognizant of which sort of logical structures I'm using.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just by being more cognizant of it, it'll make it easier to notice potential fallacies that I'm making.
Ooh,
So, yeah.
that's a great segue since that's the next chapter,
Yeah.
logical fallacies.
Yeah.
And if you want to hear a spicy one, I'm betting that this might be one of those.
All right. He's a betting man.
Thank you for joining us, book friends. Next week on the BFTTG pod, Jack and Weston, they're thinking good some more with you, our book friends. Check out the show notes or the description, comment section for a link to the book and any articles that we talk about in the show. Bye-bye, book friends.
Bye for this time, guys.
Do a good thing today.
I love you.
Love you too, dude.